Okay. Trying to think where we left off here. Okay, so I think we can begin kind of here in the middle. This is sort of where we left off last week. We established that Adolf Hitler and Winston Churchill, but really the Germans were at war. He wanted to conquer the world, but there was a deeper esoteric meaning behind what Hitler was doing. And if you're a student of theosophy, you'll know about the root races. You would also know about the sub-races, what constitutes a sub-race. And a sub-race is composed of 7 tribes, what are called tribes. And that brings us to part of the lecture that I've created just in the last few days since the events have taken place in Afghanistan. And we'll want to talk about that. But Winston Churchill was an extraordinary human being. So was Adolf Hitler. The deep esoteric secret of World War II, Alice Bailey said, nobody understood really what she was talking about at the time, is that World War II, she said, was an intertribal war. That means that it was a war. What she's telling us is that it's a war within the 5th root race. So you have to think what constitutes the 5th root race. What is the 5th root race composed of? It's composed of, up to now, 5 sub-races. The first is the Hindu, or Hindu Kush, which would include the Afghan people. The second sub-race is the Arabian, which largely was the product of the Persian Empire.
I got it.
Thousands of years. The third sub-race is the Celtic.
There you go.
Can you
The
turn
fourth
louder?
sub-race is the Teutonic, and the 5th sub-race, of course, is the Anglo-Saxon root race, which is dominant at this time in the world. It's been established by initiate teachers that both America and England were never really meant to be, by the hierarchy, to be separate entities, although they are. They are united by the fact that they share a second ray soul, but their personalities are completely different. The English have a first ray personality, and the Americans have a 6th ray personality, which unfortunately makes them prone to socialism. They like these big, extravagant, generous giveaways and programs of food stamps and free everything, which it's like somebody in England, Margaret Thatcher, said that it's all fine and dandy, but eventually you run out of everybody's money. And so it doesn't work in the long run, but we are prone to it, and we're certainly seeing evidence of that now. Churchill, let me start with Hitler. Hitler was the subrace Manu for the Teutonic or German subrace. Winston Churchill, quite rightly, was the subrace Manu for the Anglo-Saxon subrace, which includes the UK, obviously, Canada, America, Australia, New Zealand, Tasmania, South Africa, actually. There's an important thing to consider when we think about that, because it's said that out of the fifth subrace of the fifth root race, will obviously the next race will be the sixth subrace, and this sixth subrace will give birth to the sixth root race. Already evidence, we're seeing evidence, some of us are seeing evidence of an emerging sixth root race as was forecast in Australia. In Western Australia, the root races always emerge in isolation. And when the fifth subrace of the fifth root race began to emerge, it was after the Doggerland, the land that existed between France and England, was destroyed. At the time of the last ice age, actually, it may have been the ice age before, because what happened at that time, what destroyed the Doggerland, wasn't simply just flooding, although that was a factor. The factor was that there were immense icebergs that were beginning to melt, and the icebergs turned turtle up, upside down, flipped over. And when they did, it threw this lowland area called the Doggerland, which has only recently been talked about by archaeologists and scientists. The Doggerland was cut away by tremendous ice and gravel, by these immense icebergs that eventually flipped over and sent an unimaginable amount of ice, gravel, cut away the white cliffs of Dover, established the boundaries of the country of England, and created the English Channel by this immense act of nature. And it isolated the English root race, subrace, from the rest of the Teutonic and Celtic races. So Hitler himself, being a subrace Manu, was trying to revive through ritual and war, through magic, and in some cases pure evil, even though it's said that he had hierarchical support. Alice Bailey wrote about it, that he actually had the support of the spiritual hierarchy of the planet. And one of the deep, deep esoteric secrets of World War II and the involvement of Hitler with the German people was to bring war to Europe, to destroy what we call the dweller on the threshold. You have to remember that for thousands of years, Europe, all over Europe, there were constant wars. Some of them we don't even know about, so ancient, but tribal wars constantly. But that's true of the Middle East too, and the other subraces. But it was a particular problem in Europe. And the dweller is an individual thing, and it's also a group or a collective thing. The dweller. And the dweller of Europe, by the wishes of the spiritual hierarchy of the planet, had to be destroyed. And the only way that it could be destroyed was through tremendous devastation. The war to end all wars, they called World War I. It was Bailey who said that in the future, 100 years from now, they won't talk about World War I and World War II. It'll just be one war. I don't know how accurate that is. I can see it remaining two separate wars, with the third one that we are now engaged in, which Bailey said would be fought in the clouds, what she's implying is in the clouds, is in the mental planes and in the airwaves through television, which was almost non-existent even at the end of her life, and internet, which didn't exist at all and only came into being really in any magnitude in the 1990s. So anyway, it's a war of ideas. It's a war of psychology. The Chinese have been using it to their advantage. And we find ourselves in a unique situation now. If the prophecies are correct, in 2025 is one of the dates that we're given that the spiritual hierarchy will externalize. It's only 4 years away. There has to be a lot cleared up on the planet. And what we're witnessing with all the chaos in the world at this time is incoming fourth ray energy. We talked about it last week. What the fourth ray does is it brings eventually harmony through conflict. You have to go through this tremendous conflict to achieve harmony. And it's a birthing process. We are birthing a new age. The birthing process is a difficult thing. Any woman who has given birth to children will tell you it's a highly stressful, difficult period. And so too is the birthing of a new age. When the old age is dying, we're witnessing part of that, I'll explain it, is what's going on in Afghanistan with this sixth-ray blind devotional idealism of the remnants of the first sub-race of the fifth root race, who are the Hindu Kush people. They're interesting. We were watching TV earlier before we had our potluck dinner tonight, and we were talking about how many of the Afghan people look Anglo-Saxon. They got blue eyes, they got light skin. And it was said that the original emergence of the fifth root race came from Central Asia. About 1 million years ago is when it started. We also established last week that the story, the Bible story of Moses in the diaspora, the Exodus out of Egypt into the Holy Lands, was the story of the Manu, of a race of people, that Moses was the Manu figure, and that the story of the Jews is the story of the fifth root race. So it's a lot to think about, but it's setting the groundwork. Here's just some pictures of Churchill as a young man. He was destined for greatness, no doubt about it. Here's a picture here of Churchill being installed in the Albion Lodge of the Ancient Order of the Druids in Belheim Palace, 15th of August, 1908. So he had mystical roots. There was a story I heard once, I can't remember exactly, but he had a mysterious birth by virtue of the fact that his mother was pregnant, and his mother and father were at a party at, maybe it was Buckingham Palace, and she gave birth. She gave birth at Buckingham Palace to Winston Churchill, something like that. It was one of the palaces, and there was a big party, and his family were part of the aristocracy, and he was born there at one of the palaces. I think it was Buckingham. Anyway, we'll have to research that. This is an interesting photograph, and the most interesting of the two photographs is this photograph right here. There's a very esoteric story about Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt going up into the bell tower of a cathedral overlooking the Atlas Mountains. And if you're a student of the secret doctrine, and if you know anything about what Blavatsky had to say about the Atlas Mountains, then, and you know the prayer, the great invocation that Alice Bailey, through the Tibetan master, gave out at the end of World War II, the place where evil dwells. And Blavatsky said that planetary evil dwells in the caves, underground caverns and caves beneath the Atlas Mountains. And when the Allies knew that they were going to win the war, Churchill was here in Morocco with these world leaders, and I'm not sure the gentleman on the end might be a French. No, this is de Gaulle, Churchill, Roosevelt, and that might be, I'm not sure, it could be Jan Smuts, who was a South African leader. And many people believe that he himself was a fifth degree initiate being and was advisor to Hitler on various tactical military exercises and things that helped win the war. But the thing that's significant, again, is this picture. So as a symbolic gesture, we have a painting of it that Churchill did. He had these big burly army guys pick up Roosevelt, wheelchair and all, and carry him up to the top of the bell tower that was overlooking the setting sun over the Atlas Mountains. And in a symbolic way, he was declaring victory over planetary evil. The amazing thing about it was that everybody really thought, just like they did at the end of World War I, that evil had been defeated. We're not so sure about that nowadays, but with what's going on in the world, but it may be the last dying breath of the sixth ray of devotion and idealism and religious fanaticism, which has personified itself and magnified itself in the, what I believe is the first subrace of the fifth root race. The Muslim religion is the youngest of the world religions. And it may be very fitting that the time is now, and that it's this death and dying of fanaticism is coming through, I believe, through the Afghan militants, the Muslim militants, which in a very esoteric way would make a lot of sense. It's hard to get some people to understand that, but if you think about it, and if you know about the root races and the sub races and how they work, then you can factor that into the equation, because that is really one of the most salient points of this lecture, is the existence of the root races and what Bailey said about it. It is a intertribal war that Churchill was the subrace Manu for the Anglo-Saxon subrace, which is the fifth. Hitler was the fourth subrace Manu. And I believe that Joe Stalin was the origins of the Celtic. The people actually began in some portion of Russia and moved, transferred these very, many of them Aryan-like, described by Hitler and the Nazis. So the Russians were an integral part of it, and lo and behold, they too were involved in World War II in a very, very great sense, lost millions of people, many of them executed by Joe Stalin and his regime. But regardless, it's proof of the involvement of the entire fifth root race in an interplanetary war. And then if you factor in the Arabians, they didn't have a whole lot to do with it, but they do now. And the Hindus, the Hindu Kush people, I call them, primarily Indian, fought on the side of the British. And the British had promised them that if they fought in World War II on behalf of the Allied forces, that they would receive their freedom from Britain, which eventually they did through a great avatar by the name of Mahatma Gandhi, or as the English say, Mahatma Gandhi. I think that that's not level. Can you move that so it's on the green run? Yeah, there you go. And anyway, a lot to think about, but very important information. Yeah, there's a picture of Roosevelt, born into a wealthy family in New York, and was destined for greatness. No doubt about it. He was Secretary of Navy, which also Churchill was Secretary of what they called the Admiralty, the Navy, Great Britain, UK. So they had a kind of an interesting coincidental thing there. It could be that because of the sharing of a common group soul, England and America, a second race soul, that Roosevelt was functioning as a second or twin subrace Manu, because the race was so big, it was so powerful, and America certainly was expressing its power in World War II. I remember a guy I worked with, he was Hungarian, and he fought for the Hungarians, and then he fought for the Germans, and then he fought on the American side. So he had really had a lot of experience in World War II. And he said that they were cowering in a forest, and they had been pretty much defeated by the Nazis at that time. And they heard rumbling. It was early in the morning, and they heard rumbling. A few brave souls left the confines of the forest and went to the edge of the wood there, the forest, and they saw these American tanks coming. And he said they came all morning, all afternoon, and all night into the next day. There were so many tanks, they couldn't believe how many tanks there were, because Hitler had told them the Americans didn't have the ability to make war machinery. And here these tanks over a 24-hour period, it was just an endless procession of tanks, and the ground was shaking and rumbling from the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Sherman tanks that were moving into Europe for a great battle. So the power and the might of America was certainly expressed in a very positive way to benefit the Allied causes. There's Joe Stalin, who I contend, very mysterious man, very first ray. He and Hitler both had first ray personalities. The personality ray of England is a first ray personality. The masters have always said that what they wanted for America to be was they wanted a president who had a first ray soul and a first ray personality. Not to the extent that Joe Stalin or Adolf Hitler were first ray, but in the effect of being a very strong person who could protect the freedom and the democracies of the world. So here's Stalin with von Ribbentrop, the they signed a pact with Germany, which Hitler immediately, almost immediately, broke the agreement, and Stalin felt that he was on his own, and to a very great extent he was. The problem that Hitler had with Russia was the same problem that Napoleon had. The area is so vast, such a gigantic landmass, that as they moved forward, the Russians were letting them essentially move further and further in. And Hitler's astrologers had told him that winter weather would be very mild, would be a mild winter. And so the Nazis, the soldiers, were given summer uniforms and not winter uniforms. And unfortunately, the weather was the exact opposite as the astrologers had predicted. And most of them froze to death. It was the Eastern Front, and it was probably the worst place you could be in World War II at that time. And like I said, most of them froze to death. The Russians had so many people that they could afford to lose 1 million men, where it was a different story with the Germans. But nonetheless, a subrace Manu, I believe, of the third subrace. So we're pulling all these subraces in. The only one that was delinquent in World War II was the Arabian subrace, which is very active now. And there's a lot of esoteric conjecture about that. I don't know if we'll get to it or not. This is the great invocation. We say it here every week as we get ready for our dinner. I knew the lady who was there. She was Alice Bailey's youngest student. She was a friend of mine, a friend of Dr. Baker's. Her name was Rose Comito. She was a healer. She was an anchor for a healing deva. She healed me and about 100 people all at once. It was a miraculous experience that I didn't realize the full effect of until about a month later. But I had a severe back pain. I was injured as a little boy on a bicycle when my neighbor drove into me, or I actually rolled down the hill in front of him, and he hit me, and I had a terrible, always for years and years, back pain. And it was in 1980 when I was with Rose Comito and Dr. Baker at the same time. And Baker had announced that it was made known to he and Rose that there were people in the audience who were suffering from lower back pain and hip pain, that we were all going to be healed. I thought, what the heck is this guy talking about? And anyway, she got up in front of the group. There's about 400 people there, and there were numerous people with back and hip pain issues. And she said a few things, and she said, "You're all going to be healed now." And I didn't think anything of it, didn't feel anything. I just realized then a day or so later that my hip pain and lower back pain was gone forever. And it's 40 years ago, over 40 years ago. But anyway, this great invocation was given out as a new prayer for the planet that would replace the Lord's Prayer. And it's a very powerful prayer, and that's why we say it at our dinners. So this is an interesting photograph here, because this is Hitler's skull. And it shows an interesting aspect of him. He was a student of the occult. He meditated. He had long periods of silence where he was by himself, which is a form of meditation that I practice here in my home, where I live by myself. And so I have a lot of quiet time, and I live a meditative life. But the important feature of this skull that the Russians have is that the cranial sutures are well established and shows the existence of elasticity of the cranial sutures, which is what you want to maintain into your old age, is the elasticity of these sutures, which the skull is divided. That means that the skull can expand. It can continue to, the brain can grow and be modified. And it's a very, very important thing. And he maintained the elasticity of these sutures, which in most people, they become rigid and inflexible. And so does their thinking. He had a library of 16,000 occult books. And occultism at the time between, really at the beginning of World War I and up into World War II, was a very popular thing in Germany. There were all of these groups. We talked about them in last week's lecture. The Thule Society, the Golden Dawn, Aleister Crowley. The interesting thing too about the war, World War II, was that they brought in elements of the fourth root race, which are the Sino-Japanese people, that China itself was at war. The seventh subrace of the fourth root race are the Sino-Japanese, and they became involved. First, Japan invaded China, Nanking massacre. It was a horrific event. I can still see images of the beheadings that took place by the Japanese of the Chinese people in the Nanking massacre. He was believed himself to be Hirohito, a god. And so it proved that this subrace of people believed in origins of their race as being divine. The origins of all races are divine because they have a Manu and they have subrace Manus for each of the subraces, and these are divine beings. So they worshiped Hirohito. He wasn't calling the shots though. Tojo and other generals, Yakamoto and whoever the other generals were. But here it shows the propaganda that they used was not really dissimilar from what the Nazis were using, showing that the small country could slay the giant of China, that Japan was wiping out the Chinese. The Chinese got a lot of support from the Americans in World War II. I can remember being in Vietnam and being in Chinese concrete cement bunkers in Vietnam that the Japanese had built in World War II. So they were all over that part of the world. Yeah.
Can you ask everyone to turn their video off? They're we're seeing people instead of, and I don't know how to do it myself. So have everybody stop their video.
Yeah, can you turn off your individual videos and just listen? I don't know if they're watching me or what they're doing.
Yeah. It would be Sebasprad is the one who I'm seeing.
Okay, all right. You may be the only one doing it.
Wow.
Okay, so it's not letting you pick up the image on the screen, right?
Well, I can't see it. I'm seeing him.
Yeah. Okay, well, what's this image up here?
That's you.
Okay.
But this all used to be you.
Yeah.
Until he left his video on.
Yeah, so we'll have to turn our video cameras off. We're picking up one of the members of the audience. And
make sure your videos are turned off.
Make
please.
sure your videos are
Thank
turned
you.
off so you're seeing the images on
We're good.
the television screen.
Good.
I'm not exactly sure why we've got Henry VIII in there. He was a terrible guy, but he certainly was a powerful leader of the Anglo-Saxon subrace in England at that time, and is a dominant character, it seems, in English history. But they all believed in the divine right of kings. And so the royalty, this idea of royalty and the divine right of the ruler is a thing that's really carried down from the Manu figure. As I told you before, it was Moses who was a Manu figure for the, in the Bible story, is really the story of the fifth root race and the Manu Vaivasvatu. The best stories about it, the most pure, and you would expect that, are from the first subrace, which is the Hindu Kush subrace of India and really of Afghanistan should be included in that. Cromwell and Bacon were initiate beings that were instrumental and influential in the evolution of the history of the English Anglo-Saxon subrace. Both of them were fifth degree initiate beings. Cromwell might have been even higher, but he held England together during a civil war that was brutal. In a similar fashion, so did Abraham Lincoln hold America together during its civil war. Francis Bacon was a genius of his time. Many people think he wrote the Shakespearean plays. It really wasn't him. He didn't have the personality for it. And it's merely conjecture by members of academia. We wrote a book on it from Claregate College called The True Authorship, where the three great mysteries of the Shakespearean plays and sonnets is established. One, who is the true author? Two, who was the dark lady of court, which it turns out he wrote a poem to his horse. He had a black mare, and if you read the poem carefully and thoughtfully, he makes really derogatory statements about the horse, if it were a lady, because he says her breath stank, her breasts were like dung, and her hair was like wire. And it doesn't paint a very pretty picture of a dark lady of court. The other mystery that was solved in the investigation into the true authorship is, who is W.H.? Who were the sonnets dedicated to? They were dedicated to William Hart, who was a young boy, blonde-haired, blue-eyed boy of extraordinary beauty, as he was described. And the true author was a man by the name of John Richardson, who is historically noted in the documents of that part of England, Stratford-on-Avon. It's in the books. They kept good records 500 years ago. The amazing thing about the authorship of the Shakespearean plays is that this being, John Richardson, not Francis Bacon, was a Nirmanakaya, and his job was to popularize the dialect of Kent as part of the labors of the fifth subrace to make it a universal language. He and Chaucer also contributed, not as much as the true author of the Shakespearean plays. William Shakespeare was illiterate. He couldn't even write his own name. They have 6 or 7 examples. A new one just came out a few years ago of his handwriting. It shows that his hand may have been guided. He spelled his name differently on whatever documents he had to sign. But he was the liaison between the author of the plays, the true author of the plays, in the Globe theaters and other theaters in London. Theater was just emerging. And it was Will Shakespeare who was dedicated to this author, Enomanicaya, and popularized the plays and popularized the dialect of Kent, which was to become a universal language. And it's also the language that would 500 years later become a dictionary of astrology, which had to be written in the English language because of its malleability. And when you study the vast writings on esoteric astrology by Douglas Baker, you see that he even includes slang and colloquialisms in the interpretation of astrology, which nobody on the planet does. He also wrote a dictionary of the 500,000 words of the English language, in which he gives aspects for each word, an incomparable, unimaginable task of Herculean proportions. And it won't be realized for another 200 years to the extent of the magnitude of that work. Here's the Declaration of Independence, signing the documents. These were all initiate beings: Ben Franklin, Jefferson, John Adams, all of them. And they were Masons. And they broke away from the English, very largely because of the English king, who himself was suffering from syphilitic insanity. And it caused the schism, which was never the intent of the spiritual hierarchy. As I said earlier, they wanted America to remain, in England, to remain as one group, but that didn't happen. The spiritual hierarchy had influence in the signing of these documents. Many of them were hesitant. And a friend of mine, an initiate being who I lived with, he and his wife for a short time in South Africa, very extraordinary human being. I'll have to tell stories sometime about it. Said that it was Saint Germain who overshadowed the bodies of the group of people there and yelled out, "Gentlemen, sign the documents." And they then went ahead and signed the documents. Powerful stuff. And if you've ever heard the voice of a Enomanicaya, you do what they tell you to do. This is an interesting map, and I wanted to use it tonight. What we're looking at, all these, no, except for America here, but Canada, England, of course, India, these African countries here, and Australia, and of course, New Zealand, and tiny Tasmania, and yeah, there's South Africa there, all under English control. They used to say the sun doesn't set on the British Empire, and quite rightly it didn't. That's changed somewhat since this map was first drawn in 1897, but it shows the influence of the Anglo-Saxon subrace. It's no mystery to me, since they are really at the zenith of their lifespan, that everybody wants to move to America. And we see that with our problems on the border and elsewhere in the world. It's just that when my brother was in the Army back in the 60s, he said that the travel agencies in Germany didn't advertise to come to America because everybody wanted to come to America. So they'd advertise, to go to Italy or Spain or South America, someplace like that, but not to America. And he said you'd sit down at the bar with those German people, especially the girls, and they could name the capitals of every state. They could spell them correctly. It was just incredible. And probably very few of the Americans could do that. But this again is showing the dominance of an Anglo-Saxon subrace and their influence in the world, at least back at the time of 1897. The architecture too was a key factor in that there was an explosion, because it's an expression of the wealth, the money, and the power of the Anglo-Saxon subrace in the world, and it's undeniable. Rockefeller Center, the Empire State Building, the Art Nouveau architecture there, the doors of the elevators in the Empire State Building, incredible stuff. Albert Hall, fabulous structures. So this whole idea that Hitler was pushing was for what he called the Aryan race. He saw it as being Teutonic, and he would put on these that the origins were Teutonic, and they would have these elaborate plays and parades where men would be dressed in like Teutonic knights, and they'd parade through the cities of Germany. Extraordinary productions. This is a map of Europe that was under the Nazi control in 1942, and they appeared to be unstoppable. And my dad used to say if there'd have been more of them, they probably would have got the job done. Don't know, but a lot of people believe that. Heinrich Himmler was a master of black magic, and he was aware of Steiner's work. I told the story last week of the process of agricultural chemistry, a part of it that was used to rid the estate of Lord Kingserling's. Estate was being overrun by rabbits, and Steiner didn't want to kill all the rabbits, so they sacrificed one rabbit. They burned it. They took its ashes. They mixed it in distilled water, and he sprinkled it around the corners of Kingserling's estate, and the rabbits fled. They could smell, their olfactories are sensitive, and they could smell the ashes of the cremated rabbits. Himmler came from an agricultural family. I think they were involved in agricultural chemistry, and I can't remember if it was him or one of the others, also farm equipment. But I think his family was involved in agricultural fertilizers and things like that. And it was his idea, Himmler's idea, based on Steiner's practices on Kingserling's estate, to cremate the Jews. And it's a well-known, well, not well-known in the sense that everybody knows it, but historians know it, that they took the ashes of the cremated Jewish people and they spread them throughout Europe. And the idea behind it was to, in the same way that the rabbits were driven off of Kingserling's estate, that the Jews would be driven out of Europe. And that was his thinking behind the cremation of the Jews. There was a definite reason, and it involved really principles of black magic, and Himmler was a black magician, no doubt about it. Here's this picture of Himmler here at Dachau, one of the concentration camps, famous, infamous in World War II. So these are migrations that took place after World War II. And these migrations are not really dissimilar from the migrations of the various root races. So there's this constant migration of, we talked about it a little bit in our lecture on the pyramids, Göbekli Tepe, and the Bosnian pyramids, of a migration of people who spread throughout Europe, largely from Egypt after the destruction of Atlantis. And as I told the story about Samuel Osmaganich, who was the man who discovered the Bosnian pyramids, he thinks that it began there and spread to Egypt. But if you know the true age of the Egyptian pyramids, really the Atlantean pyramids, not the Egyptian, then that are 80,000 years old, his argument may be true that the Bosnian pyramids are 25,000 years old. The origin is still out of the Giza Plateau. In fact, we established last week, this part of Europe is filled, now really a large part, and in England as well, with gypsies. And the gypsy, the word is a slang term for Egyptian, that their origins were Egyptian, but they were also out of India, and they came across through this part of Central Asia over into Europe. And some of them even went back into Egypt and then back out again and around, because there were different floodings. There were different events. The Black Sea at one time was a smaller freshwater lake. Now it's brackish sea, where the Bosphorus Straits were flooded during one of the ice ages, and the water is now brackish, a mixture of salt water and fresh water. Charles Leadbeater, the great theosophical clairvoyant, he said before he died in the 1930s, he said that the fifth root race would undergo tremendous catastrophe, that there would be the loss of millions of lives. And shortly after he died, World War II broke out. It was already really beginning. But he saw what was on the horizon. And what was on the horizon was the great intertribal war within the ranks of the fifth root race, and he foresaw the whole thing. He said that this would happen because the fifth root race was halfway through its life cycle. And whenever a root race reaches the halfway point of its life cycle, tremendous destruction takes place, and indeed it did. He predicted the Saxonification of Europe, but what he was really implying was he was implying the Saxonification of the civilized world. I can remember being in Africa, and young African boys who worked on a farm that a friend of mine owned, a huge, thousands of acres farm. They'd come to work and they'd have, Detroit Tigers baseball caps down in South Africa, and dressed in blue jeans, and were mimicking, Americans, being primarily Anglo-Saxon. English speakers and learners globally. Right now, tonight, in China, they say that there are 100 or 200 million Chinese, estimates as high as 300 million Chinese learning to speak English. English is common in India. So it's all over the planet. And again, it goes back to the authorship of the Shakespearean plays, because the author knew 500 years ago that 500 years into the future, what he was writing would popularize the English language. It was a catalyst to spread all across the planet. Absolutely true. They work that way, Nirmanakayas. They may live in a time frame that is allowing them to express energies that will materialize 500 years into the future. The work is powerful and potent and should never be taken lightly. Oppenheimer, Groves, and Edward Teller, the guy, I can't think of his name right now, invented heavy water, that made this all possible, went to high school with my grandmother. And I have to look his name up for when I give this lecture again in the future. They said that the reason that they were able to develop the atom bomb so fast was because they were reincarnated Atlanteans and had made atomic weaponry before in previous Atlantean civilizations. Mohenjo-daro in Pakistan, once part of India, is a place where some sort of an atomic war took place, and they know that by the fact that the rocks and the structures, the buildings, were vitrified. That means the rocks were melted at a temperature of probably vitrification, I think, is 2,800 degrees. And of course, it can be even hotter than that. But vitrification took place in Mohenjo-daro, where, and the Hindu scriptures talk about these wars, these fiery wars that took place in the ancient Hindu texts. It's worth thinking about. Again, the first subrace of the fifth root race. So here's the Japanese surrender and the guys on the moon, and it shows the power of this Anglo-Saxon subrace that was victorious against Hitler and the Nazi movement known as World War II. A tremendous event. And of course, the use of the atom bomb on the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had a profound significance because it proved that all matter is made of light. I was very fortunate as a young man. I got to go to an art college where I had a theosophist teacher, and I had a brilliant non-theosophist who was interested in quantum physics. And so the one guy would talk about theosophy and art, and the other guy would talk about quantum physics and art. And years later, I realized they were both talking about the same thing. Very fortunate. School no longer exists in its form as it was in those days. But the atom bomb was a significant initiatory event. The original plan was to use the atomic bomb on the Germans, and through spiritual hierarchical intervention, the hierarchy was able in the astral world to influence the thinking of the American generals and leaders of the world to use it on the Japanese, on the remnants of the fourth root race. And if you think about that in esoteric terms, it makes a lot of sense. Very abstruse, but it's worth considering. So that's the lecture. The thing that I wanted to talk about tonight, briefly, what time is it?
8:22.
8:22. So we got just a couple minutes. Is what I see happening in Afghanistan is the emergence of the Muslim race, Muslim religion, the youngest, as I said earlier, of the major religions on the planet, expressing itself. It's really dying. It's proof that it's dying in that the sixth ray of devotion and idealism, which they express fanatically, is dying out, and it's the last dying breath of the sixth ray and its energies. And I think that there'll be eventually an uprising in the Middle East and in the country of Afghanistan, and that those radical units of Islam will be overthrown or just die off. Eventually, they'll die off. It's like Bailey said about cancer, that it was a disease of Atlantean origin. What that means is that eventually it'll just die off. Nobody will get cancer in the future because the karmic implication of the people who have cancer, they will have all paid their karmic debt. She said it was a product of a psychological disorder that evolved out of Atlantis. That's a very broad statement, I might add, but it's worth thinking about. So what we're witnessing, I believe, is the death of the Piscean age, the death of the sixth ray. We're witnessing this conflicts in the world, which are fourth ray products of the fourth ray, which is art and harmony through conflict. It's if you would have told somebody at the end of World War II that the Germans and the Japanese would one day be America's greatest allies, they probably would have locked you up. But that's exactly what's happened. Fourth ray, that was a fourth ray experience. The fourth ray is a very powerful influence on the planet Earth. And we're witnessing it again with a rebirthing of this fourth ray energy, which is bringing upheaval. Bailey said that one of the things that would happen, we've talked about it before, the fourth ray would kill off blue flowers all across the planet. There was an article 9 or 10 years ago in in Scientific American magazine that said that inexplicably blue flowers were being dying off, and scientists couldn't explain it. So Bailey's comments are apropos. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
I have a comment, not a question. I saw a video recently on YouTube that's sort of tangentially related to your last two lectures.
Mhm.
It's called Nietzsche and the Nazis.
Mm.
It has to do with the Nietzschean philosophy, which
Mhm.
the Nazis and the intellectual circles picked up on. And
Yeah,
used
distorted it, but yeah, used it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very good. Yeah, it's worth consideration. Sure. Yeah. Right.
What is heavy water?
Heavy water, that in order to make the atomic bomb possible, they had to have water for the cooling tanks. As I understand it, Ron?
Heavy water. Hydrogen has one
One,
proton and one electron.
okay,
Heavy water
is,
has a neutron,
mhm,
which is unstable and decays.
Mhm.
And if you have radium or uranium, the decay of neutrons in the nucleus is what causes the release of energy for the atomic bomb. So heavy water with a neutron in its nucleus was very big. It was unstable, and they worked with that to let me put this, the nucleus of heavy water decaying and giving off a neutron was very important to the development
yeah.
of the radiation.
Couldn't have had it without heavy water. The guy's name that invented it was Harold Urey. He graduated from Kendallville, Indiana High School with my grandmother, and made it all possible, but probably a reincarnated Atlantean. They have in the little town, it's funny, it just shows you how screwed up things are. There's no record of this man ever existing.
Whoa.
But when you come in from the east or the west on the major highway through town, there's an announcement that Brad, whatever his name was a basketball player in the NBA. He's from Kendallville. But Harold Urey, who invented heavy water, he's not recognized. Tell you like that. True story.
Of course.
Okay. Is anybody here online? Do they have questions?
If they, I don't know how they raise their hand on this.
We have to apologize for our Zoom meeting tonight. Our normal person that helps us is in North Carolina. And so we're kind of all lost.
Oh,
Unmute 'em all, Tracy. Unmute them all if you want to.
yeah, okay, that's what I'm gonna do. Ask everybody, no, let me. do this.
Unmute. Yeah, that.
Okay, they can all unmute now.
Okay, if you're unmuted and you want to ask a question, we may have time.
Yeah, I have a question. This is Jeff Crone about Israel and how does that fit into the scheme of what's happening in the root races and sub races?
It's a good question. The Jews have always been hated and despised. And when it came to the sub races of the root races, it was said that the Jewish people were the first to attain, as a group, collectively, a high degree of spiritual evolution. And they had a choice that they could take a spiritual path or they could take a materialistic path. And they decided to take the materialistic path. I don't know how true that is. But Bailey said that the Jewish people during the time of World War II and even in World War I were a group of people who suffered from heavy karma. And it was their karma, if you can believe such a thing, I can believe it, that they would suffer the wrath of the Nazis in World War II, that there was karmic cause and effect. And that, you don't always incarnate as a Jew. You don't always incarnate as a white Anglo-Saxon. So it was a collection point, a repository, the Jewish race or the Jewish religion for people with a very, very heavy karma, as Alice Bailey said. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, anybody else? If not, we'll call it a night, and we'll talk about something else next week. Don't know what, but something.
Going out to the lobby.
Was there quite a few people on there? On Zoom?
I don't know. How many did we get tonight?
Oh, you had your bullet points.
Yeah.
6 people. 6 people.
6.
I'm trying to see how to close it out.